I feel ashamed of what I have to tell about what's going on in Holland, but I do hope that by the presentation you will get a kind of realistic picture. I also know that sometimes in the papers and in the media in other countries, the situation in Holland is represented in an exaggerated way, too dramatic. I mean, it is dramatic in a sense what's going on, but overstatement weakens the criticism. So what I'll try to do is give a realistic picture of what is going on with respect to euthanasia practice, and then give also from a Christian perspective and against the background of the Dutch experiment, as you could call it, and a short overview of arguments for and against euthanasia. You will certainly notice that some of the things that have been said today by other speakers will come back, but I hope that by putting them in this perspective, it may kind of strengthen your vision and understanding of the issue. On June the 1st, 1994, so last year, the new legal regulation of euthanasia, assisted suicide, and life-terminating actions, as they are called, without a request, became effective in the Netherlands. And in fact, we can see this regulation, and also the years before it became effective, as a kind of an experiment. Will it be possible to tolerate and regulate euthanasia while at the same time keeping it under control and within specific limits? This paper presents, as I say, an evaluation so far. I'll try by presenting the situation and do so by first mentioning a few definitions. I think this whole issue, it is so important to have clear definitions and to know what you're talking about and to have a clear reasoning. This again came out from other presentations as well. Can you read it? Well, I will read it, so if you can't, you won't miss the most important parts, but it may be a help, but we'll try. The definition for euthanasia in Holland now is the intentional killing of a person at his request by a physician. So what is commonly called voluntary euthanasia is in fact the definition of euthanasia in Holland. And when there is no request, we do not talk about euthanasia, but about a life-terminating action without a request. Very difficult way of talking, but that's the way it is. And in fact, as I say, it's more important to know what we really mean by a word than the exact meaning or scope of it. It is important in this discussion to distinguish euthanasia from a few courses of action that sometimes are confused with euthanasia or may seem like euthanasia in certain respects, but I think should not be confused with euthanasia. And these you find them mentioned briefly on the overhead. First, stopping or not beginning a treatment at the request of the patient. And secondly, withholding a treatment that is medically useless or futile, if you like. And third, pain and symptom treatment with, as a possible side effect, a shortening of life. I'll go briefly through these three courses of action. First, stopping or not beginning a treatment. Foregoing treatment, we heard about this morning. No patient may be treated without informed consent. That's the legal point of view, but I think there are also moral reasons to give for this. And the patient is entitled to refuse treatment or to withdraw consent. And as a rule, the physician should respect the wish of a fully competent patient. And when that is done, and the patient dies soon after withdrawal of life-supporting treatment that was refused by the competent patient, this cannot be classified as euthanasia, I think. We may discuss it, the morals of it, whether a fully competent patient should refuse life-supporting treatment or not. There are hard cases for sure, but it is not euthanasia, I would claim. Second, withholding treatment that is medically useless should not be provided and can or should be withdrawn when it is provided or medically futile. This of course raises the question, what is medically useful treatment. Well, we heard a whole discussion, a whole representation about it. I'll sum it up by saying what I think could be, as a rule of thumb, described as medically useful. Such treatment fulfills the following two criteria. First, the treatment is effective and proportional, which means that the expected benefits of the treatment outweigh its expected or possible risks and burdens for the patient. And second, the evaluation of benefits, risks, and burdens for the patient should only take into consideration medical criteria, not an evaluation of the value of life for the patient, Now, it's surely the case that medical judgment of proportionality is not a totally value-free evaluation. To a certain extent, such an evaluation is personal and subjective in the sense that different people may evaluate things differently sometimes. But I think this is why medicine is a moral enterprise in the first place, inherently moral enterprise, and why medical practice cannot do without medical ethics. It's important to note that, talking still about B, that the withdrawal of futile medical treatment does not intend the death of the patient, or at least should not. Neither can the death of the patient in a moral sense be considered the result of such withdrawal. In other words, there is morally a fundamental difference between killing and letting die. Only when medical treatment that should be considered proportional is withdrawn with the intention to bring about death, letting die morally equals killing. Third course of action, pain treatment aims at the alleviation of the patient's suffering. It may shorten life of the patient in certain circumstances. However, actions must be defined morally according to their aims and not according to inevitable side effects. So the shortening of life as a side effect of proportional pain and symptom treatment is a morally correct action, I would say, and should not be classified as euthanasia. Here, the principle of double effect applies. Now I'll go on by telling a bit about the data. Some of you will have read these in literature. I will just give a brief presentation of the main data for those who do not have them in mind. I'll not go through in detail, but some of it is important for understanding the discussion and the developments. There are 129 cases of death in the Netherlands in a year. These data actually apply for 1990, but they are supposed to be more or less annual data. So 130,000 people die. Requests for euthanasia is 9,000. 9,000 people ask for euthanasia each year. But of these, 2,300 are granted, so to say, are performed. Which means that not every request for euthanasia is rewarded, or whatever you like to, what word you like to use, is granted, is done. In Holland, this is, by those who favor the situation, this is presented as proof that doctors are very careful in the way they proceed when there is a request for euthanasia. There are 400 cases of assisted suicide and 1,000 cases of life-terminating actions without a specific request, or non-voluntary euthanasia, if you like. 1,000. So this altogether makes 3,700 cases of euthanasia in a broader sense. In addition to these actions, though, we find quite a number of actions and two categories I should mention specifically. That is, one, the intensification of pain and symptom treatments, and then there are different intentions behind. First, taking into consideration the probability that life would be shortened, but not intending. And then second, partly with the purpose of shortening life, and third, with the explicit purpose of shortening life. And these are just about 8,000 cases. 8,000 cases in which doctors intensify the medication for pain and symptom treatment, partly or with the explicit purpose of shortening life. And the same situation, similar situation in not starting or stopping a treatment. Here again, there is a category in which it's taken for granted that life may be shortened. It's accepted, I should say, whereas in other cases it is with the purpose, either partly with the purpose or explicitly with the purpose to shorten life. And here again, about 8,000 cases. There are 5,800 cases in which patients ask for withdrawal of treatment or refuse treatment, and the doctor does so at the request of the patient. Here again, I think this is not euthanasia. So far about these data. These data, however, raise a few questions. The 1,000 cases of life-terminating actions without a specific request, they caused quite some uneasiness in political and medical circles because it was contrary to the established requirements. And one liked to believe that these requirements were generally well observed. And it should be noted that in these 1,000 cases, the physicians distinguished these actions from the intensification of pain treatment with the explicit purpose of shortening life. So apparently, the intensifying pain treatment with the explicit purpose of life did not bring about death straight away, which did these 1,000 cases in which people actually were killed by the doctors without their explicit request. And further, about a quarter of these patients, of these 1,000 patients a year, so that whose lives are terminated without request, a quarter of these patients were competent to a certain extent, but their lives were terminated by the physician without an explicit request. The intensification of pain and symptom treatment and foregoing medical treatment, 8,000 cases in each of these courses of action, can be good practice, even when this may involve a shortening of life. We were just seeing before, these courses of action should not be confused with euthanasia. But however, then it should be a side effect and not the intended result. Yet in quite a number of cases, physicians reported that the intensified pain and symptom treatment or stop treatment with the explicit purpose of shortening life or partly with the purpose. In my opinion, the intention to shorten life shouldn't be part of professional ethics. But on the other hand, the intention itself does not make an action to euthanasia. It is the factual, intentional shortening of life which makes a certain action into euthanasia, not just the intention. And the survey did not ask the physicians what they really did and in how far they considered their treatment, their pain treatment, proportional to the pain, to the situation of the patient. And therefore, it is unclear to what extent these 8,000 cases were more or less cases of euthanasia or really was good medical treatment. And this means that we do not have a clear picture of the real euthanasia practice. In spite of all the data we have, we certainly do not have a clear picture of what is really going on. And it's clear that this will hamper effective control. The new regulation that became effective, as I said, in June last year, started in fact with the Supreme Court's ruling in 1984, which is over 10 years ago, that a physician who commits euthanasia can, in cases of an objectively established conflict of duties, appeal to a defense of necessity, as it is called. This is an article in the Penal Code. That is a defense of necessity you can apply to when there is something you have done in a conflict of duties. You have observed one rule and transgressed another. Now, this conflict concerns, in these cases, that the courts accept. This conflict concerns, on the one hand, the duty to obey the law prohibiting euthanasia, and it still is, in the Penal Code, the prohibition of euthanasia. So in that sense, euthanasia is not legalized in the Netherlands, in that formal juridical sense. So on the one hand, to obey the law. On the other hand, the duty of the physician to alleviate suffering and respect wishes of the patient for a death with dignity. Now, the court ruled that the conditions establishing such a conflict of duties essentially are free, a well-considered request, unacceptable suffering, and consultation by a colleague. These are, in fact, summing up the five requirements that have been formulated also by the Dutch Medical Association and by the courts, the 5 requirements that should be fulfilled when a physician commits euthanasia. Voluntariness, a well-considered request, a durable death wish, but in fact you can sum up these 3 by saying a free, well-considered, consistent request. And then unacceptable suffering, but essentially it is the patient who decides whether the suffering is unacceptable or not. And the consultation with another physician who should see the patient and reporting the case of euthanasia. The government approved the Supreme Court's decision, thereby accepting euthanasia under certain circumstances. At the same time, however, the government sought to maintain its responsibility for the effective protection of human life by maintaining the prohibition of euthanasia and assisted suicide in the penal code. And it tried to reconcile these 2 aims by giving a statutory basis to the procedure by which physicians have to report every case of euthanasia, assisted suicide, or non-voluntary euthanasia. It did so by amending the law on the disposal of the dead. So the new law, which is a change of the law on the disposal of the dead, the new law, in fact, is not so much a regulation of euthanasia as a regulation of a reporting procedure of euthanasia. And in terms of this procedure, a doctor who has terminated a patient's life informs the local medical examiner, who inspects the body externally and takes from the attending physician a statement which contains the relevant data, like the patient's history, the request, possible alternatives, consultation, and so on. This report of the physician who did the euthanasia, together with an evaluation of the local medical examiner, who came to inspect the body, the dead body, externally, are then sent to the public prosecutor, who considers if the termination is contrary to the penal code as interpreted by the courts. Because that it is contrary to the letter of the penal code is evident, but it is then evaluated whether it is contrary to the penal code as interpreted by the courts. Whether this appeal to the defense of necessity will be accepted. And it virtually always is accepted. We'll see that later on. I will raise a few points of criticism. So far it has been rather a presentation of what is going on than an evaluation. Where am I? I have 4 points of criticism. In the first place, in addition to the 2,300 cases of euthanasia that I showed before, this number, there is apparently a large gray area between good medical practice and the intentional shortening of life with or without a request. And it remains unclear from the survey what the physicians actually did in these cases. But the intention to shorten life makes these actions, I think, ethically suspect. And as these actions are not reported, they are not required that they are reported, control on what happens is virtually impossible. And second, the majority of euthanasia cases were not reported. You find here an overview of the cases, the number of cases that are reported, and you'll see that in 1984, 16 cases, and it increases gradually, and then in 1991, 590, in 1992, it's 1318, it doubles suddenly, and this is because of this more legal situation that though formally the law became effective last year, in fact the regulation, the kind of agreement the government had with the physician started already in 1991. And then you find more people, more physicians who dare to report. And you also see that only very few cases of these cases that are reported are investigated by the legal authorities. So the large majority of cases are just accepted. So the majority of the cases in 19 these were only 30 to 40% of the cases were reported. I think this has gone up a little bit because, as I showed, it's about half of the number of cases of euthanasia from 1990, which is 2,700, let's say. About half that number is reported. But we do not know whether from 1990 until now the number of cases has increased also. It's very well possible that it may be have doubled also. Nobody knows because there has been no investigation after that year. 60 to 75, or let's say 50% at least, of the cases are not reported, and falsely and unlawfully the physicians certify death by natural causes. Important reasons for failing to notify are to avoid the administrative fuss involved, not to bother the family with the investigation. But we are talking about killing a person. The reported cases are the well-performed cases. When the doctors, everything went all right, there was a written request of the patient and everybody thought it was the best and it was an acceptable suffering, and so on and so on. Then these are the cases that are reported because the physicians know that the legal authorities will accept that this was a legitimate case of euthanasia. And the real situation is concealed by terms that are thought to satisfy the legal authorities. So even when they report the good cases, they do it in such terms the physicians know that the legal authorities will accept. And they know this because they have compared, there's an investigation who compared the official reporting of the euthanasia cases with anonymous surveys of what they really did. And then you see these differences. A fourth point of criticism is that the new procedure also raises questions on the position of the medical examiner. He is supposed to sign a form stating that he has checked the notification of the physician who performed euthanasia and found that the procedure has or has not been followed according to rules. However, in most villages, smaller towns in the Netherlands, the medical examiner is working most of his time as a family physician, and he is a colleague of the other family doctors in the place, with whom he has to collaborate, has to exchange, take patients during weekends, and so on. So in such situations, the medical examiner will experience, of course, strong social pressure to give his approval of euthanasia cases, even when he has doubts about whether the requirements really were followed. Furthermore, it is impossible for the medical examiner to check the most fundamental criteria, namely whether the patient was suffering intolerably. How is the physician, the medical examiner, afterwards going to control whether that was the case? Or whether the patient itself said so even? Or whether the request was completely voluntary and well considered, because the person whom it concerns has died. So you can really question this whole role of the medical examiner, which should give, I think, this whole procedure a kind of legitimacy, but which in fact is more a show, I think, than a real control. So pro-life doctors are really wondering now whether they should participate in this kind of procedure at all. The legislation did not stop the developments nor the discussion. A landmark in jurisdiction was the decision of the Supreme Court in June last year, 1994, so about 10 years after the first important decision. And this concerned a case of a psychiatrist who assisted a woman to commit suicide. A woman was depressed because of very sad personal experiences, including the death of her 2 sons. One had committed suicide as a soldier. The psychiatrist had reported his life-terminating action, so his assisted suicide, had been acquitted by 2 lower courts before the Supreme Court investigation. And the Supreme Court decided that in principle, a physician can also appeal successfully to necessity, to the defense of necessity, after performing euthanasia or assisted suicide on patients not in a terminal stage and with psychic rather than somatic suffering. To ascertain the free request of the patient, a second psychiatrist must have seen the patient and confirmed that there are no other possibilities to alleviate the suffering. So when there are other possibilities to treat, to alleviate the suffering, then assisted suicide in cases of psychic suffering is not allowed, according to this ruling of the Supreme Court. The present cabinet has adopted this decision as a guideline for their policy of prosecution. And in fact, the ministers of justice and of public health who deal with this apply this rule also to somatically suffering patients, which means that the public prosecutor has dropped the prosecution of physicians who euthanized somatically suffering patients that were not yet in a terminal stage, because the terminal stage, the final stage, was no longer a requirement for euthanasia. It can be concluded that under strict conditions, euthanasia and assisted suicide have also been accepted for non-terminal, somatically or psychically suffering patients. We see here gradually widening the categories of patients that are included in this regulation. But it goes on. The most recent significant development concerns 2 cases of severely handicapped newborn babies who were killed by their physicians at the request of the parents. The first case was brought before court in May this year, just 2 months ago, while the second case is still under investigation. And I happen to be one of the experts that the court is consulting in this second case, so I think there will probably be more dissensus than in the first case. In the first case, the baby had spina bifida, hydrocephalus, and brain damage and other disorders, really in bad shape. The specialists decided not to operate on the spina bifida because of the bad prognosis. In itself, I think this can be a good decision. The baby appeared to suffer severe pains that were hard to treat. This is all according to the way it has been presented afterwards, of course. The parents did not want the baby to suffer and asked for the termination of her life. 3 days after the baby was born, she was killed and died in the arms of her mother. The physician appealed to the defense of necessity, and the district court accepted this appeal. The main requirement formulated by the court in this occasion was that the patient, the baby, has intolerable suffering with no prospect of improvement. The suffering must be incurable, cannot be alleviated, at least not in a medically useful way. And with the latter phrase, they mean that the only way to alleviate, treat the suffering, the pain, would be to bring the patient, baby in this case, to a kind of permanent coma. But in personal conversations with other physicians, this point is doubted whether this really was the case with this baby. The killing of babies in certain cases is defended basically by 2 lines of reasoning, by an ethicist who was consulted by the court, by another physician, and it's also by the lawyer who defended the physician. 2 lines of reasoning. First, stopping or not initiating a treatment and accepting that a patient will die is construed as a decision for death. So they say we decide not to operate. This means that we choose for death for this patient. And once it has been decided that medical treatment is no longer useful, and one accepts that the baby will or may die, there is no fundamental moral objection any longer against killing the baby. Under circumstances, one even ought to do that in order to prevent the baby from more suffering. And closely related, secondly, to this reasoning is the rejection of the principle of double effect. They say that accepting that pain and symptom treatment will shorten life is not fundamentally different from intentionally shortening life by medication to the extent of practically killing the patient. I think that both arguments have been rejected above already in presenting these courses of action which should not be considered euthanasia. And in fact, advocates of euthanasia and life-terminating actions are very ambivalent, if not contradicting themselves in putting forward these arguments. For when they interpret the findings of the euthanasia practice as I presented them in the beginning, They do distinguish between euthanasia on the one hand and stopping or not starting treatment or intensifying pain treatment, even with the intention to shorten life on the other hand. Then they make the decision. Because if they would not, the number of cases of euthanasia would be very high indeed. But why not? Why denying then the distinction between foregoing disproportional treatment and proportional pain and pain treatment, taking for granted an unavoidable shortening of life on the one hand, and the intentional killing on the other? This is a similar distinction. Why do they accept the distinction when they talk about euthanasia? Why don't they accept the distinction here and are saying that when you stop treatment, you choose for death? You may well kill the baby. This is very inconsequent. And though the higher courts will still decide on this case, this judgment may well be a first step towards the formal acceptance of non-voluntary euthanasia, the practice of which has already been demonstrated. But it goes largely uncontrolled by the legal authorities. So far for the regulation. Now I will briefly say arguments about for and against euthanasia. The major argument of those who approve of euthanasia as it is presented is the principle of autonomy of human self-determination. More and more, the right to self-determination is extended to the moment and the way one is going to die. One should not await death with fear and trembling, but one should bring it about willfully by a free decision of an autonomous person who has chosen to step out of this life. That's the right to die rhetoric, as Nigel was saying this morning. Illustrative for the rise of this mentality in the Netherlands is the wide support for a proposal of an elderly, well-respected man of law. He suggested that from a certain age on, people should be able to obtain, at their request, a kind of euthanasia pill from their physician, so that they were able to finish their lives as soon as they thought it was time to stop. This proposal got really wide support by many people in the media. A second argument is the health concept in society. Health is understood more and more as an ideal of vitality, wholeness, even beauty and the sense of well-being. Healthcare and medicine are expected to maintain or restore health as much as possible. And when a certain health condition is a prerequisite for a meaningful life, then life loses its meaning when that condition becomes unattainable. So when a certain situation of illness and discomfort and dependency has been reached, and the burdens of life outweigh its benefits in the opinion of the person, the death of the sufferer is considered an advantage for everybody involved. So why not bring about death? A third argument is, I think, the argument for control combined with mercy, compassion, as it is presented. It is true that in modern medicine there is a tendency to gain control over life. The intention is normally to maintain life and health as much as possible, which is the mission of medicine in the first place. However, the enormous technological facilities make it possible to prolong the life of patient into a situation which for the patient turns out to be unbearable. And I really think that the euthanasia debate and the claim for euthanasia is partly, not largely, but partly a result of tendency of overtreatment, of going on with treatment, technological medicine. So we should be aware of that as well. Such terrible suffering at the end of life should not be tolerated, so the reasoning goes on. Man has a right to die with dignity. And then we see that the aspiration for control over life may lead to a choice for death. And killing the patient is then considered an act of mercy of the physician and of beneficence towards the patient. Of course, a lot more could be said, but I think these are the main arguments presented, at least in the debate in Holland, and I think more widely. What arguments can we and are put forward against euthanasia? I mentioned about 5 here. Some of them have been mentioned in some context already, but I go through it quickly. First, I think the concept of autonomy is inadequate, and I have 4 reasons, at least from a Christian perspective, why this is so. First, it is inadequate anthropology, because it considers man basically as an individual who by his reasoning can decide about norms and values and make decisions about his life. But that which makes a human being really human is, in this view, his reasoning. But this anthropology fails to recognize the importance of social relationships, of the spiritual, of historical dimension of the human being, which in the Christian view all should have a place. Second, this autonomy concept is unrealistic, particularly in healthcare. Can a very ill person really make an independent, free request to be killed? A Dutch neurologist has argued that the very fact of being in a terminal state, as well as the medication that is often given in these circumstances, make a clear and normal functioning of the brain almost impossible, which is necessary for a voluntary, independent, free request. Furthermore, the patient is completely dependent on others who, through their attitude, through gestures, through even tone of voice, in a subtle way, sometimes in a not so subtle way, can suggest the patient to ask for euthanasia. And especially for the physician, this is very well possible and can even happen unconsciously, I think, if the physician is of the opinion that euthanasia could be a good solution. Furthermore, the autonomy of the patient cannot be a decisive reason for accepting euthanasia simply because the physician is performing it. This means that in performing euthanasia, the physician freely and intentionally kills a patient. It changes the physician because it makes him into a person who killed another. But the free and intentional killing of another person, even with good intentions, subjectively, will influence the attitude of the physician towards people in general and towards very ill patients in particular. And this means that euthanasia regards other patients as well. And therefore, it cannot be considered as an affair of the individual patient and his or her physician. It is a public act and can therefore not be based on the autonomy of the individual. Lastly, for Christians, most decisive objection against the autonomy is the biblical teaching about God's sovereignty. God is the creator and therefore the Lord of life. The best known formulation of the prohibition to terminate a man's life is the 6th commandment, you shall not murder. In the New Testament, this is one of the commandments Jesus explicitly radicalizes. He doesn't abolish it at all. In the Christian view of life, the question whether life is valuable is not determined by functions or capacities that can objectively be verified. The value and the dignity of man reside in being created by God and in being called to live in a relationship of God, of love with God, with fellow people and creation. In these relations, the physical existence is fully involved. As long as there is a living human being, humanhood implies personhood. Because this roots in the relation with God, which cannot be measured medically. A second reason is that euthanasia very often is a sign of insufficient or inadequate care or attention. The patient feels uncomfortable, has pain, is worried about what will happen, is worried about relatives or relationships sometimes. Such a request for euthanasia should be taken as an appeal to our responsibility to provide the care needed. Good care and attention by physicians, by nurses, attention by relatives, adequate pain treatment, in most cases make a request for euthanasia disappear. Exceptions to the rule may exist, but exceptions shouldn't determine morality nor legislation. Next argument is the slippery slope. And we have seen in the Netherlands, the slippery slope is not just theoretical hypothesis, it's in reality. It's a practical reality. From the data, we can conclude that not so much the request, but rather the condition of the patient is the fundamental reason for physicians to terminate a patient's life. We see that though it is presented as a case for the autonomy, that in practice it is the condition of the patient which for the physician is a reason to perform euthanasia, not the request. The request makes it easier, probably, and legally makes it certainly easier. But when the condition is the main reason, then of course when a patient who cannot ask for euthanasia any longer, but is in bad shape, which in the eyes of the physician would be a reason to terminate the life of the patient if he could ask for it, then the reason that the patient cannot ask for it may be considered insufficient not to kill the patient. And so we see that the whole way it is proceeding, that the condition is the reason, and that the slippery slope from the voluntary to the non-voluntary euthanasia is inherently in this whole defense and practice of euthanasia. The next reason is a doctor-patient relationship. Acceptance of euthanasia will seriously change for the worse the doctor-patient relationship. Somebody said, there is an inherent conflict of interest between the beneficent healing and comforting role in which life and wholeness is sought and one in which death is caused intentionally. The acceptance of euthanasia as part of good medical practice will definitely change the attitude of healthcare workers to terminally ill patients, both competent and incompetent. Henk, who has written several articles on the situation in the Netherlands, has given several examples of the new mentality that is coming up in the Netherlands during this, because of this whole development. And when you look at some of these cases, the case which I have been involved now of the baby that has been killed clearly shows that just good professional medical care, it seems as if physicians don't know what it is any longer. In certain circumstances, I wouldn't generalize too much, but it appears that when killing becomes an option, people are not that inventive, are not dedicated any longer, apparently, to really find a solution to help and to care for the patient and give up easier. It may be granted that when the life of a patient is intentionally terminated, death itself is not the good sought for, but the elimination of suffering. However, medicine should fight suffering because of the person and should not turn against the person because of his suffering. Behind this way of proceeding, I suspect a distorted understanding of medicine, a view of medicine in which medicine is responsible for the relief or the alleviation of all suffering. All suffering is considered wrong, and its relief, for which medicine is held responsible, is considered the highest value. But I think this is a misunderstanding of the character and an overestimation of the task of medicine, which entail the danger of overtreatment on one hand and of considering killing a task of medicine on the other. Both involve a dehumanization of medicine. It is very important that physicians are able and willing to recognize the limitations of medicine. We heard about that in earlier presentations this morning, so I'll not go on in this, but just mention it. Last point. Kolakowski, a Polish philosopher, Marxist background, has argued that the unique and irreplaceable character of each human being has been a fundamental value in European culture. Accepting that it would be right to kill certain people would be a denial of this value, he says, and would mean cultural suicide. He acknowledges that his conviction that this would be cultural suicide if we would accept that people may kill others. He says that this conviction about the sanctity of human life cannot be proven. I agree. This conviction rests on certain basic beliefs, just as any other conviction does. In the Christian view of life, the respect for human life, irrespective of its conditions, is based on the belief in a personal God who created the human being in his image. In conclusion, I think the Dutch experiment of trying to regulate euthanasia while at the same time keeping it under control has failed. The experiment has demonstrated that once euthanasia is officially approved and practiced, that practice develops a dynamic of its own that resists effective control and that tends to expand. The experiment failed, but I'm afraid that the consequences will be irreversible for quite some time at least. And it's astonishing that so many people in Holland do not seem to realize how much the present situation, how much a situation of euthanasia practice that cannot be effectively controlled by legal authorities corrodes the very basis of our constitutional state. Fortunately, the number of initiatives in hospice care which may provide an alternative to euthanasia is also increasing, not least by Christians. The Word of God is not just for the private life of those who believe in God. His commandments apply to all people, Ecclesiastes 12:13, because they make life flourish. And when life presents us with situations so hard that there seems no good solution, the desire to follow God's indications will help us to find a way to go.